Good evening and welcome to this new podcast called Inside Afrika. On Inside Afrika, we're talking everything Africa, giving you information about the key news that's been taking place across the continent over the last few weeks. And also we'll be talking to you about also some very interesting developments regarding the continent's growth, be it economically or otherwise. And so in this maiden edition of Inside Afrika, we'll be doing a special regarding the legacy of South Africa's last white president, W De Klerk, or Frederick Willem de Klerk, who died last week. Now, to some, he was emancipator. To others, he was a despot who benefited from apartheid and who escaped justice because of what he did. So we're going to go into this and give you an African perspective on the legacy of South Africa's last white ruler, Frederick Willem de Klerk, otherwise known as F.W. de Klerk. Now, F.W. de Klerk was born in 1926, and he was born into what we know as apartheid South Africa. So South Africa didn't start apartheid officially until 1948. But when de Klerk was born in 1926, apartheid was there in some form, although it was not legalized as we know it to become. So de Klerk, who was a Afrikaner, okay, of Dutch descent. So the Afrikaners are basically Boers who are of Dutch Huguenot descent, okay? And their ancestors came or landed in the Cape of Good Hope around about 1659, okay? So de Klerk ancestors came from the Huguenot tribe or people of the Dutch Holland, and also has some French origin as well. And so, like I said, de Klerk was born in what was known as South Africa in 1926, and he was groomed into the whole apartheid machinery. This is a man who benefited from apartheid. So, like I said, he was an Afrikaner, and in that time, and still to today, Afrikaners, enjoy a privilege in South Africa. So where the Afrikaners control was like the Cape Town area, and also what was known as Orange Free State, now called Orange State, the Pretoria, Johannesburg area, okay? That was the mainstay or the bastion of Afrikaner rule. And so Willem de Klerk grew up in an apartheid South Africa. It wasn't officially apartheid, but it was apartheid because he grew up, with Africans as his maid at his parents' house, growing up. He grew up seeing African people as second-class citizens in their own country. And he grew up at a time when African people had no rights, let alone the right to vote. And so de Klerk, his young life was brought about being an all-white environment, okay? So being an Afrikaner, he had privileges that Africans in South Africa could only dream of. So he went to an all-white school, a predominantly Afrikaner school, and he was steeped in that Afrikaner privilege. And so let's not, think for 1 minute that this man was not privileged. He was privileged, and by his privilege as Afrikaner, he was able to move up into the ranks of the National Party. The National Party is the party that created legalized apartheid in 1948. Believe it or not, apartheid is still there, but we'll get to that in a minute or later on in this podcast. So like I said, he was in the National Party, and he shared the tenets. Yeah, so this man is called the so-called emancipator, but he actually shared the tenets of African supremacy over African people in South Africa. He may have been a liberal Afrikaner, but nonetheless, he was an Afrikaner who believed in the rights and privileges of the Afrikaner and the right to maintain African supremacy over South Africa, but particularly over African people. And so he was also, and many people don't know about this, and this is not told in the white mainstream media, that De Klerk was a part of the Afrikaner secret society called the Afrikaner Broederbond. If you don't believe me, you can go and Google it for yourself. He was a member of the Afrikaner secret society called the Afrikaner Broederbond. Okay, that is the Afrikaner Brotherhood. And that brotherhood was intent on keeping power, white power, particularly for the Afrikaans-speaking people of South Africa. And De Klerk was a big-time member of the Afrikaner Brotherhood. Okay, so let's go now to his involvement in the National Party. So like I said, being privileged in that Afrikaner circle, he became enrolled into the National Party. For those who are not aware, the National Party of South Africa is the party that was formed by Jan Smuts and Conrad Verwoerd, who were the main architects of apartheid. Apartheid is a Dutch word meaning separate. In this case, separate classed on racial specifications. So you're European or Caucasian, you're African, you're Asian, and then this kind of benign term colored, which basically stands for mixed race. That is how South Africa was divided under the constraints of legalized, formalized apartheid. Okay, and so the National Party, which was the party that instituted the apartheid, was the party in which De Klerk, the young De Klerk, was groomed. So he bought into the idea of Afrikaner white supremacy in South Africa and benefited from these privileges of being Afrikaner, Caucasian in South Africa. So this notion that the Western media are given that he was the man that ended apartheid is wrong, because A, he opposed apartheid, he benefited from apartheid, and he did not see the need until later on, which again we'll come into later on, to end apartheid. And so De Klerk was no way a so-called emancipator of African people in South Africa. So it is a fallacy for others to come and say that De Klerk was somehow, this emancipator of a liberator in South Africa. In actual fact, Nelson Mandela, who for me, one could say was a sellout, particularly in the negotiations that led to him becoming president in 1994, he even said, okay, in his book, Long Walk to Freedom, that he's talking about De Klerk now, that despite his, i.e. De Klerk's seemingly progressive actions, Mr. De Klerk was by no means the great emancipator. And Mandela goes on to say, he did not make any of his reforms with the intention of putting himself out of power. He made them for precisely the opposite reason, to ensure power for the Afrikaner in a new dispensation. End of quote. This is Nelson Mandela in his book, Long Walk to Freedom, talking about W De Klerk. So despite the Western media hype, and this is the man that ended apartheid, Nelson Mandela talks about of him being contrary to what the Western media want you to believe, that W De Klerk was somehow a liberator, an emancipator, and the architect of the end of apartheid. Far from it. So when De Klerk became president of South Africa in 1990, that was a time when the Cold War had ended. It was a time also that the Berlin Wall came down, and that the main protagonists of apartheid, Don't forget that the West supported apartheid. Britain, the US, Canada, Australia, France, Germany, despite what they're saying now, they all supported apartheid. They funded apartheid by giving South Africa arms, excuse me, by allowing South Africa to develop nuclear weapons of mass destruction. In actual fact, South Africa was the only country in Africa that had a nuclear capability. And this was done under the apartheid, various apartheid regimes. Okay, so pressure because of the Berlin Wall that came down in 1999, and also the end of the so-called Cold War, pressure was put on de Klerk to release Nelson Mandela in 1990 because of two things. One, because of the pressure, but more importantly, and this again is not told in the Western media, that Black people worldwide were protesting against apartheid. So when you had bogus sanctions, so for example, Britain under Margaret Thatcher did not vote for sanctions on South Africa because Margaret Thatcher's husband, Dennis, had business interests in South Africa. And therefore, Britain did not buy into the notion that sanctions should be served against South Africa. So it was the liberation struggle, the African liberation struggle, spearheaded by the likes of the ANC, spearheaded by the likes of the South African Communist Party, who went on protest and also guerrilla warfare. Yeah, so some of the tactics that they did was to disrupt power lines, was to disrupt, some of the train lines, was to basically disrupt the economic human life in South Africa. Yeah, and we also know of things like the Soweto uprising in 1976, whereby African people were boycotting the schools because they said that they don't want to teach in a person's language, Afrikaans. Afrikaans was taught to African people, and African people said, no, we refuse to learn this language of the oppressor called Afrikaans. And that led to the Soweto uprising, in which many African children were killed by the South African police force, which was predominantly a white police force, which had at its head W De Klerk. So de Klerk, even before becoming president, was highly involved with covertly in the murder of African people. And so how can we say that this man was a liberator when in actual fact he was a murderer and was responsible for the killings of Black people? So let's roll on to 1990, like I said, when he became president after another fascist, P.W. Botha. So in 1990, he became president. And like I said, because of there's a sway of support from the African world. For example, many African countries, again, this is not told by the Western media, Nigeria alone gave more than $50 million to the ANC to support their struggle against apartheid. Countries like Ghana, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Angola also gave South Africa money in their fight against apartheid. Also, some of the elders in the ANC who were banned from South Africa, people like Oliver Tambo, Walter Sisulu, Governor Mbeki, they were exiled in other African countries. There were also protests, for example, in the UK, outside South Africa House. And these are done by, in the main, African people. So African people in the diaspora, their pressure on South Africa led to the international white community to pull out, i.e. its financial support to the wicked apartheid regime in South Africa that denied the human rights of African people. Yeah, so this is why de Klerk had to release Nelson Mandela in 1990 and had to lift a ban on the likes of the South African Communist Party and the ANC. This is why de Klerk released Nelson Mandela, not because he loved Nelson Mandela, not because he wanted to unban the ANC, but because of the pressure as a result of African worldwide protests and also the lack of support from their Western donors or the Western partners or the Western brothers that put pressure on de Klerk to release Nelson Mandela and unban the ANC in 1990. But as Mandela says in his Long Walk to Freedom, even during the negotiations, de Klerk was not willing to hand over power. He wanted to keep the Afrikaner brother, or the Afrikaner interest in South Africa at bay. Yeah, because like I said earlier on, de Klerk was a member, a high-ranking member of the Afrikaner brother bond. And so de Klerk's allegiance was not to a so-called new South Africa or Rainbow Nation, but his allegiance was the Afrikaner brother bond, and to secure to ensure that the Afrikaner rights, culture, language, tradition, and more importantly, their economic infrastructure was intact. And because Nelson Mandela allowed himself to be used and also to be manipulated by de Klerk was able to pull one over Mandela, and as such, you know, Mandela was not able to talk about the land issue. Mandela was not able to talk about, you know, more opportunities for blacks, etc. So de Klerk, you know, like I said, he reluctantly freed Nelson Mandela from prison and, you know, unbanned the ANC and the South African Communist Party, amongst other political parties. And so these negotiations were stalled. They were fraught in the negotiations because, like I said, de Klerk wanted to keep white power in place. He didn't really want, you know, the ANC to gain a lot of ground. But nonetheless, for what it was worth, the so-called negotiations ended with the first multiracial democratic elections in South Africa, or with the ANC won by a landslide. But that's half the story. Because like I said, the Afrikaner economic stranglehold was still intact. And like for many of you listeners who are listening, thinking that apartheid is over because Nelson Mandela became the first so-called black president, you are sadly mistaken, right? One of the greatest white journalists that I respect, John Pilger, he put out a video you can get on YouTube called Why Apartheid Never Died. Why Apartheid Never Died by John Pilger. I urge you to get that video on YouTube, because in that video, John Pilger explains explicitly why apartheid did not end with Nelson Mandela and the ANC taking the reins of power in 1994. In actual fact, to this day, to prove that apartheid has not ended, that despite all the, you know, efforts of the ANC, still 80% of the best land is still in white or European hands. Yeah, and they make up 13–40% of the population in South Africa. Today, despite the ANC, despite Mandela gone, Thabo Mbeki gone, Zuma gone, the majority of the business and the economic interest is still in white hands. Yes, there's white poverty, but the white poverty levels are nowhere near the African poverty levels. In actual fact, since Mandela became the so-called first black president, black people's quality of life has actually gone down, not gone up. In actual fact, you got a small black middle class, particularly though there's elites in the ANC who are doing well because they've used the power of state to enrich themselves. I'm talking about the majority of African people in South Africa. The majority, the quality of life for the majority of African people in South Africa is very, very hard indeed. Youth unemployment in particular is a main issue in South Africa. In some places, it's about 80% youth employment for African people. And this will lead to the spikes in African against African attack that we see. Black or African South Africans beating of the Nigerian, the Ghanaian, the Zimbabwe brothers, because they believe that the Zimbabwean, the Ghanaian, the Botswanian, the Gambian has taken their jobs. When into the say of the ANC, because of the bad negotiation that Mandela did with de Klerk, failed to build proper jobs, that has led to this high unemployment among Africans in South Africa. That's why they think that their black brothers from outside are taking their jobs, because of failure of ANC to negotiate properly with de Klerk and co in order to bring about real change in South Africa. And so for me, de Klerk is no hero. He's a terrorist who presided before he became president and during his presidency, before handing over to Nelson Mandela. He presided over the murders of millions of African people. In 1993, Chris Hani, the probable successor to Nelson Mandela, was killed in Bophuthatswana by, assailants linked closely to the government of de Klerk. And so, even the murder of Chris Hani, right? There was a strong suspicion that de Klerk may have been involved in that murder of Chris Hani. And so, for me as African, de Klerk escaped justice, like P.W. Botha and others, because these people are murderers who preside over the murder of African people. They escaped trial, and that farce called the so-called Truth and Reconciliation Committee was actually indeed a farce, because all of these white criminals who were involved in murdering African people in South Africa went scot-free. No one was accounted to book. And then they want to conspire with Winnie Mandela, the late great Winnie Madikizela Mandela, that she was responsible for killing people. Oh yeah, what about de Klerk and those other henchmen that were involved in the mass murders of African people? And they were also the ones who tried to create a civil war within the African community by trying to divide and rule in Inkatha Freedom Party, which was the KwaZulu-Natal party, against the Afrikan National Congress, the ANC. We also saw what happened in Bophuthatswana on the eve of the so-called first multi-party election in South Africa, when there was a war between white supremacists who tried to ferment division between the Inkatha Freedom Party and also the ANC. So for me, de Klerk dying last week is of no main significance. It's a shame that he escaped justice as being the last white ruler of an apartheid state. And to end, South Africa is still an apartheid state. Like I said, white interests, particularly conglomerate economic interests, are still in hands of white people. And 80% of the land is still in white hands, despite white European people making just 13% of the total population of South Africa. And so for me, de Klerk, one of the benefactors, one of the main characters of the enforcement of apartheid, particularly during the 70s and 80s, has died, but died a criminal, died a murderer, and died as somebody who escaped justice. And so I hope you've enjoyed this interesting take of the legacy of W De Klerk, South Africa's last president. And we will bring you some more views from an African perspective on Inside Afrika podcast in the coming weeks. And so for myself, Kwame, African historian, writer, broadcaster, thank you for listening to this edition of Inside Afrika. And if you like this content, you can help us with the content by subscribing to the podcast, telling your friends and family, sharing this with your friends and family, and also by contributing to our Patreon account for as little as $1 a month. So from myself, Kwame, and from the rest of the crew here on Inside Afrika, thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next week.